Thank you for being here. My name is Pedro Rios. I'm the program director for the U.S. Mexico border program, which is based out of San Diego. I've been with AFSC now for 14 years there in San Diego, and it's been a pleasure to work with so many of my colleagues, not only there, but throughout the U.S. and also meeting with colleagues from different parts of the world. So it's always a pleasure to learn that there's so much expertise in the work that we do throughout the organization. The topic for today is on the U.S. Mexico border and what communities are doing to resist the militarization of our community that has been going on for many, many years. But before we get to that point, what I'll do is begin by placing the border militarization within its proper historical context, and then hopefully we'll learn a thing or two as we go about our session. So I'd like to ask you first to tell me who you are, your name, where you're based out of or where you work, and then if you have ever been to the U.S. Mexico border, and if you have, which area? Start with you.
Kat Northup, representing North Pacific Yearly. Home is Montana.
Okay.
I've not been to the border.
Richard Coral and Live Oak Friends meeting in Houston, and South Central Yearly meeting, and I've been to Boquilla Canyon and Rio Grande, or in the Big Bend.
Mm-hmm.
I've been to Laredo, El Paso, and one farther down, I forget what it is, but several places on the Texas border.
Okay, great. Thank you.
My name is Scott. I live across the river in Haddonfield, New Jersey. Many, many years ago, I took a train from El Salvador to California, so I crossed the border there. And I've traveled along the southern highways in the U.S., again, a long time ago, so close to the border.
I'm Riley Robinson from Washington, D.C. I'm a corporation member, and long ago I was on the board, and the board used to have its meetings in different locations around the country, and one time we were in Southern California, and we took a trip down and visited the San Diego and along the border there.
I'm in Keeler. I live in Santa Monica. I've been down to Tijuana many times, and also to Nuevo Laredo.
I'm Gene Haskell. I live here in Philadelphia, and I think that I drove from San Diego down to Baja, is it?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I went all the way to the border. But
Yeah. Well, that would have been the border if you drove through to Baja. Yeah, you would have crossed. Yeah. Well, great. For me, it's good to know that way I have an idea and sense of what your experience might be, and that helps me think through of how to go about this workshop. So, if someone were to ask you, what's the first impression that you get when you think about the U.S. Mexico border? What comes to mind? First thing that comes to mind.
For me, it's the Rio Grande.
Okay. Anything specific about the Rio Grande?
It's a porous, changing
Okay.
border. Provides water for both sides.
Mm-hmm. Water, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, anyone else?
that Trump wants to build a wall.
Little does he know, or maybe he does know, there are already walls there.
Yes, I know there is a wall. We see the picture of it a lot.
Yeah.
He doesn't know.
Well, there's a lot of traffic that goes through at the border of Tijuana.
Yeah. What's the longest that you've had to wait and the crossing from
a
to
couple
San Diego?
hours.
Okay, any other thoughts about the border? First thing that pops into mind?
Well,
Big business is
immigration.
trade.
Yeah.
Business, trade, yeah. I know I misspelled.
It is long.
Long border.
It's huge.
If people,
How long is
I don't know whether you call it the border or not, but you know, when you come up even north of San Diego, there's that other place where you always stop.
so a checkpoint in San Clemente?
Yeah,
On the 5?
yeah.
Yep, there's a checkpoint.
people try to come into this country and avoid the border if they can, or avoid the checkpoints or the immigrants coming.
Okay. Trying to not get caught.
Not get caught.
Okay. All right, so the border is many things, and I think, you know, it's important for me to say that I grew up along the border. The San Diego border is my hometown, and I have seen the border transformed over the course of my time being there. There was a time when I did move away from 1995 to 2002. So when I returned in 2002, post September 11th, the type of border that I knew that was my hometown had dramatically shifted. I would say probably what was much more impactful to me was the level of sophisticated enforcement that existed post 9/11 to prior to 9/11. And so that's something I think that I will discuss to some extent in terms of how border policy has been done over the course of the past several decades. But before I begin, what I would like to show is, you know, we hear a lot about Trump wanting to build a wall, and we hear a lot of rhetoric about the border being porous or being insecure or being dangerous, Wild Wild West. This tends to be the popular discourse that we hear on the cable news channels or the national news channels. And so there's one clip that I want to show, which I think frames what I knew as a border when I was growing up. And this is a clip that was recently shared with me by a woman who lived through, she was a teacher in the southern part of San Diego, and she lived through some very horrendous circumstances with the teenagers who were accosting her with writing swastikas and KKK on her blackboard, and she filed complaints and filed suit against the school district for not protecting her. But she provided this clip to me, and I want to share it with you because the youth that are highlighted in this video were the same age. I was the same age as they were when this video was made back in the early 90s, 1991 to be specific. And so it describes the borderlands of what I knew when I was growing up. And so I'll play this short clip and see if we have some thoughts on it.
It's a border in violent convulsion, a no man's land of brackish swamps and bamboo groves, referred to by the locals as Little Nam. And like Vietnam, no war has been declared, but the casualties are mounting on both sides of the tortilla curve. In the past 2 years, over 100 illegal aliens were murdered in San Diego County. The coroner lists 1/3 of them as John Does.
We document assault and abuse by customs agents, border patrol agents, combined agencies like the Border Crime Prevention Unit, which is police and border patrol. Over the last 5 years, at least in about 40 shooting incidents, at least 22 people have been killed and another 35 wounded.
Border officials are understandably defensive.
the Border Patrol agent uses his weapon absolutely as a last resort. Another.
Okay, so that clip then depicts what the border landscape was when I was growing up, and that area that they're talking about, which they describe as Little Nam, is the area that is essentially just about 5 miles from where my home was, where my parents continue to live. It's still there. It's actually been much better preserved than what it was 30 years ago or so, but it's where Friendship Park is located, and Friendship Park is the southwesternmost area of the U.S. Mexico border. It's where families are able to go and meet, and the fence divides them, and they see each other on the weekends. And so the reason why I played that clip is to give you a sense of what the border was prior to changes that took place in the mid-90s when President Clinton passed or signed the policies that led to the creation of Operation Gatekeeper. And Operation Gatekeeper was a part of a Southwest enforcement plan that had the intention of diverting the migrant flow from the urban areas to the rural areas. And so from 1994 to current time, we started seeing an increase in the number of deaths that started taking place as a result of that. But you all have some numbers, and what I would like for you to do is to try to see if you can find what you believe might correspond to those numbers. So there are some different there's different information on the papers that are on the floor, and the numbers you have will correspond to some of those. So I want to do that in order for me to see if we can address some of the details about what border militarization is and how border militarization shows up in the communities. So go ahead and if you could do that, look around and see what you believe the number that you're holding represents a statement or a fact that's on the piece of paper on the floor.
Well, you just said Clinton diverted
Operation Gatekeeper.
instituted operation.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll have to
So you got a good one then. I supplied the information.
CBP?
Customs and Border Protection.
million miles? Ooh.
correct.
Well, some of them are tough, like there's a 4,000 and a 3,000. I mean,
Something with 15 million miles? Really? That's a lot of miles.
That's a lot of mileage. That's a lot of going back and forth. Yeah, so I think there might be one or two that are correct. The year that Operation Gatekeeper was implemented, 1994, that's correct.
You said that.
Yeah. So what I'm going to try to do is address some of these as I give the presentation, and then at the end, hopefully, we'll have some time to correct the ones that are missing. So, one of the reasons why the AFSC does its work in the border is because back in 1977, which was when the U.S. Mexico border program began, there was an increase in mistreatment and abusive practices by law enforcement agencies, together with, so it was a federal immigration law enforcement, but also local law enforcement, and then also you had vigilante groups. So for instance, in 1980, the KKK did what was known as a border clan watch. They went to the border and were positioned there to detain people who were coming across. So in the same way that in 1991, when I was in high school, when these youth were in high school, the same type of activities the KKK was involved in. Because in San Diego County, northern San Diego County had a big presence of KKK that later became the White Aryan Nation, so it was white supremacist organizations in San Diego County. And then you might have heard in 2004, 2005, when the Minutemen did their border watch campaigns in southern Arizona, in San It was the same sort of language. We want to do we're just like a neighborhood watch group. We want to make sure we protect our communities, and so they stationed themselves along the border. And the AFSC was pivotal in training people to monitor their activities and to document any abusive practices that would take place. Going back to 1977, when there was an increase in abuses, but also an increase in mistreatment by even private citizens. And so what people tend to live through, the community experience then is one of state repression. So a lot of ICE agents going to people's homes, or Border Patrol going to people's homes and questioning them, detaining people, then eventually deportation. And so the border itself becomes a site where deportations take place. On the average, it used to be that roughly around a little over 1,000 people were deported every day. That number dropped significantly last year. I think it's closer to 600 and something. But the experience is still one of dread, one of concern. And how that shows up in the community is, here are two separate examples. One is that part of the work that we do is we respond to calls from the community that either ICE or Border Patrol is involved in different operations, that they're detaining people somewhere. And that has increased significantly with the new administration. So here's a report on Facebook that, when I received it, had been shared over 500 times. The report essentially says that there's a Border Patrol detaining people at a local supermarket. What was interesting to me is that the image of the Border Patrol vehicle is of a Border Patrol vehicle. The markings of that vehicle have not been used in over 10 years. And so what that told me is that this is not a verifiable, it's not a true announcement. Someone created it in order to create that fear and tension in the community. And unfortunately, it does have that real impact, that real effect. And the belief amongst us as advocates was that there was a competing supermarket that created this announcement or to scare off customers from that particular, they can go to the other one. However, we also incidents. So on these two separate images, we have in this middle one Border Patrol conducting a home raid close to a school at the time when school children are being let out from classes. So you have parents that are going to pick up their children and suddenly are fearful because the entire street is blocked. There are federal agents all over the place at 2 separate homes. And so it suddenly becomes, there's an immigration raid taking place. I need to go and hide. I need to call my neighbor who does have documentation status to go and pick up my children for me. And so in 2007, we documented when ICE shut down a street, an entire block, and went house by house by house by house, asking people for documentation status. So it's not something that's unheard of. It's been documented. In the other image, we got a call that Border Patrol was at a local shopping mall, and they were conducting a raid, a random raid. We did document, I documented 4 Border Patrol vehicles, and they were detaining an individual. It was a targeted raid. However, to the general public who's there, they will interpret that as being a random event, and people are being questioned simply because of how they look. And so you have fears and rumors that create greater tension in the community, some of which are not substantiated and others are. Our function as a human rights office in San Diego is to then verify the information with Border Patrol. And that's what I did, and that's how I was able to obtain certain information about the targeted raids that took place. And I also shared with them this image and told them that what we are confronting is this increase, the tremendous increase in fear of community members because of the rhetoric that we have heard over the last year and a half. But along with the rhetoric, it's been a history of what I would say is a Washington consensus, irrespective of which party is in office, that the enforcement apparatus has been significantly sophisticated, especially since September 11th, that it doesn't matter who's in office. There are ICE agents that are working on a daily basis. There are Border Patrol agents that are working on a daily basis to conduct raids, to conduct different operations in different parts of San Diego County and in different parts of the border.
Pedro,
yeah.
Did you, or would you be also be looking to report something like that to Facebook as non-factual?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So we do that both with the media. So recently there was a home raid that my colleague Benjamin Prado was able to document in the community of Linda Vista, which is a part of the city of San Diego. We got a call, and I got messages through WhatsApp, if anyone uses it. And messages were a video footage of what appeared to be an ICE raid. And that was our thought going in. So then Benjamin went to the location, and he was able to document, and he was able to verify that in fact it was not an ICE raid. It was a U.S. Marshals together with the sheriffs, together with other law enforcement agencies that targeted 1 or 2 individuals. And so the very next day, the local Spanish language Univision interviewed me about it. They were under the impression that it was ICE. And so on camera, I clarified that it was not. And so for us, it's important to clarify when it's not and when it is, because we don't want to spread false information. And we do a training to community members about how they can document events that involve immigration agents.
Can you ever prevent them?
Not entirely. So since 2002, 2003, the American Friends Service Committee has been working with community partners to document when immigration officials are involved in a specific type of immigration operation. In this case, it's the Border Patrol that's boarding the public transportation system It's the trolley that runs in different parts of San Diego County, from the border to the eastern part of the county to the northern part of the county. We've also have documented ICE operations. And this is my colleague Benjamin Prado, who's employed by AFSC. When he was documenting this, he was not an AFSC employee, he was a member of the advisory committee for the U.S. Mexico border program. So I'll let it play out for you a little bit. And you can see the agent has asked the woman for documentation status. She's showing him her documents, which is an ID and probably a legal permanent resident card.
Green card.
Yeah, a green card.
Hey, what's going on, man? Wait a minute. You're filming me. You're impeding me. What are you doing? Can you talk? Okay, hold on a second. I need to ask your citizenship. Come here. State your citizenship. Let's get a citizenship.
I refuse to answer any questions. I refuse to answer
Hey,
any
come here,
questions.
Gary. Come here. I'm gonna have to ask you to come with me. You're under
No,
arrest.
hey.
Under arrest.
Fue detenido el 25 de febrero mientras grababa las actividades de la patrulla fronteriza en el sistema de transporte público y su equipo de video fue destruido.
Is that a legal arrest?
It was illegal arrest, unlawful arrest. Why? Because filming in public is, First Amendment protected right, and also his Fourth Amendment rights were violated. He should not have been detained. That particular unit was known to be an aggressive unit of the Border Patrol based out of the Imperial Beach Border Patrol Station. Benjamin did file a lawsuit against Border Patrol, and he did win because of his First and Fourth Amendment violations. But the purpose of documenting is for us, it serves two purposes. One is that we hope with our presence, we're able to prevent any civil or human rights abuses from taking place because they know that they're being watched and recorded. And secondly, we learn what tactics the Border Patrol or ICE use in their operations. And this is information that then we can provide in community forums or at workshops for community members so that they're better prepared to deal with this type of scenario. But it's also part of the training that we provide to community members. Sometimes a lot of the video that we are able to gather is from community members that have been trained. And we do have communication with law enforcement. We tell them this is part of our function. As a human rights office, part of our function is to record and document operations that could infringe on people's basic civil and constitutional protections. And I'm gonna jump to an ICE raid so you can see that as well. These are all images of people that have been taken out of the buses and have been detained. Oops. So this is an ICE raid that was taking place at the home of a community member whom we had trained to be a human rights observer. And so many of the people with whom we work are people that are out of status or who have family members who are out of status. He called us, and so two of AFSC staff people were documenting their operation. Our function is not to prevent them. We're not going to block them. It's not, our role is not to prevent them from doing the function that they're charged to do. It's to document. If we were to get into that situation, then it would be, I think, it would be a different role that we would need to play and different types of training that we would need to have. But as I mentioned earlier, it provides us an opportunity to have a better understanding of the types of operations, what they look like. A video that I have on here as well was in the community of Linda Vista in San Diego, where ICE agents jumped out of a UPS truck and did a large-scale raid on apartments where largely are populated by Spanish-speaking or indigenous language-speaking Mexicans from southern Mexico. All right, so as I mentioned, the video footage that we have is it dates back to 2003, actually 2002 and to the present. And so as we are entering into this new dynamic of the Trump era, the Trump administration, where there's a lot of fear for immigration enforcement policies that he has been announcing, especially through the new executive orders that are in place, it's important to contextualize that within what has been going on for decades. And so how I like to divide that is by describing the decades on how border and immigration enforcement policy have been developed mainly through the lenses of war. So if we look into the 1980s, the war on drugs, the 1990s, the war on criminals, and then September 11th, the war on terror, from 2008 to 2017, which was the Obama administration. There was the war on the spillover violence, so there was an attempt to disassociate himself from the language that was used under the war on terror language from President Bush. And so all of these begin to compound upon each other to create the conditions that we have now. So to give you an example, after September 11th, the Department of Homeland Security was created in 2003, and they amassed a large number of different federal agencies, 3 of which deal with immigration, and that's CBP, Customs and Border Protection, and ICE. And the other one is CIS, which does the citizenship and processing and those sorts of things. They have a small enforcement unit mainly charged with investigating fraud. So if someone is trying to adjust their status and they're claiming to be happily married, but in fact they're doing it because they have other reasons, then they have a unit for that. But what's most concerning to us are the Border Patrol operations that are under CBP and ICE, because those are the enforcement units that more than likely are impacting the communities with whom AFSC has a relationship.
Question?
Yes.
We tend to assume that Trump has initiated very evil immigration policies and enforcement policies, and has initiated a lot of deportation. But I'm beginning to learn that Obama did just as many. And I don't know whether they were as mean and nasty, but a lot of people were deported under Obama.
That's correct. That's
so
correct.
Not much has changed. It's just the way it's presented.
That's correct. In fact, there was a reason why President Obama was called the deporter-in-chief. He was called the deporter-in-chief because he deported more people than any other president prior to that. And so the tactics changed, though, where, for instance, under President Bush, there were much more flashier operations with helicopters and buses rounding up a lot of people at a work site. Heavily armed agents would go in. Under Obama, he shifted that by using local law enforcement. So there were certain operations. One was called Operation Secure Communities, which was if the person is arrested, their fingerprints would be cross-referenced with the Department of Justice through the FBI, which would then share that information with the Department of Homeland Security. So then the agents would request a hold on the individual so that they could question that individual. That was later considered to be unconstitutional. But just to give you an example, under Operation Secure Communities in California, there were over 400,000 people that were deported during when Operation Secure Communities was in effect. So it's a huge number of deportations. About 2.5 million, I think, is what I have heard. In 2012, so about 5 years ago, It was probably the highest number of deportations, over 400,000 deportations in 1 year. These are removals. And so the impact isn't only on that person that was being removed, but the impact is on the entire family, especially if there are children involved. There are a couple of schools in Baja California which are catered to English language speaking children of deportees. Because when the father or the mother is deported, or the family is deported, their U.S. citizen children, will go with them as well, unless they have family members here and they make other arrangements. And so you have a large group of U.S. citizen children who essentially were removed with their parents who were deported. So it is a real scenario in that sense. In the 1980s, it's important also to point out that when President Reagan signed IRCA, which is the Immigration Reform and Control Act that legalized about 3 million people, that was kind of like the beginning of a greater border enforcement movement through the administration. Even though we had seen this, or it had happened through the Nixon years, it was really funneled in a much more faster way under President Reagan. In fact, there was a very important change that he made to the Posse Comitatus Act, which prevents the U.S. military in engaging in domestic operations. And so that allowed then for the U.S. Marines to be involved in drug interdiction programs along the U.S. Mexico border. Are you familiar with Redford, Texas?
No.
So it's around the Big Bend area.
Okay.
So in 1997, a platoon of Marines were following a young man, Ezequiel Hernandez, who was walking his goats. He had his grandfather's old shotgun. He was followed for a distance, and then he was shot and killed by the platoon of Marines. Because apparently he heard some rustling, he turned around, checked it out, and turned back, and then he was shot and killed by the platoon of Marines. It was out of that grand jury investigation that the public became aware that the Marines were operating along the U.S.-Mexico border in these drug interdiction programs, and that they were surveilling a large number of the population of not only Redford, Texas, but also were making the claim that every single person who lived there was potentially associated with the drug cartels in Mexico, which was completely untrue. These are largely impoverished communities that don't have the means to have those relationships. So those are examples of how the compounding then takes place on border militarization. The war on criminals, if I could just speak a little bit on President Clinton, who's not on here. Okay, he should be on there. So President Clinton, he made some significant changes to immigration law in 1996. This was in response to a growing anti-immigrant movement from the early 90s to the latter part of the 90s that was in some ways catapulted by the governor race in the state of California. When Governor Pete Wilson was running for governor, he was running against Kathleen Brown, sister of Jerry Brown, and he adopted the anti-immigrant platform from a group called Save Our State. This group would have these actions on the border where they would call light up the border and put flashlights or car vehicles along the border, and they followed the sort of same logic of the KKK and the white Aryan resistance in doing these border clan watches and such. So having been driven to victory by an anti-immigrant policy and Proposition 187 out of California that sought to make educators, doctors, and social service providers quasi-immigration enforcement agents, President Clinton then continued by adopting an anti-immigrant policy and passing what was the IRA that had the effect of the retroactive criminalization of people who had been convicted or charged with crimes many, many years ago. And so that's when we started seeing an increase in people that were detained for immigration violations. The present time period, I don't know what to call it just yet. Maybe in about a year or so, I'll have another name for whatever war we can call it. It does, follow President Obama's attempt to disassociate himself from the war on terror, the spillover violence that he claimed was taking place. Sure, there were some border towns in Mexico that were extremely violent, namely Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez. However, consistently, El Paso and San Diego have been at the top 2 and 3, or 1 and 2 now, safest cities with populations of over 500,000 people. So it's always interesting. And one of the things that people fail to know is that under President Obama, there was something called Operation Fast and Furious, which was a funneling of Fast and Furious, which was funneling of arms to drug cartels in Mexico. And these were involved in at least 2 killings of federal agents, Agent Zapata in San Luis Potosí and Agent Brian Terry, who were both killed by people who crossed the border that were using weapons, U.S. weapons that were funneled to drug cartels in Mexico by the U.S. government. So these are actually, and there were hearings that were held, and unfortunately not a lot of information.
What was the goal of this policy?
It's unclear. I mean, I think the goal was to try to track where they were being used. These are more the covert type of operations. Yeah, it's hard to tell. Yeah.
And what's the spillover violence?
The spillover violence is exactly, it's basically the idea that the violence that was taking place in Mexican cities was spilling over to U.S. cities. When in fact, one could make the argument that the reverse might be true. That was sort of in response to the funneling of weapons into Mexican drug cartel hands, for instance.
Oh, it's funny, a more normal pattern, like in Afghanistan or these other places, is we arm people for one purpose and then the arms go to somebody else that
Sure.
we're not happy with.
Sure.
I mean, that's happened a lot.
Yeah, and that's one of the programs that AFSC has out of San Francisco. The work that John Lindsay Poland does is essentially calling attention, trying to get the U.S. to stop arming Mexican officials, because oftentimes those arms are used to suppress popular movements and not so much to stop the drugs that are coming in from other parts of the world and being and where Mexico becomes that passageway. Yeah, it's quite fascinating. So the enforcement landscape has been one that has developed over the course of time. So as I mentioned earlier, we do have a border fence. We actually have 2 border fences in San Diego, and in some places there are 3. The border fence changes depending on what it intends to block. Here, this is Friendship Park. This is an event that we have on a yearly basis called La Posada Sin Fronteras, or the Posada Without Borders. It's a reenactment of the nativity scene. We hold it during the month of December. And so it's also the place where every weekend families who are dealing with the family separation issue go to the park and they're able to visit with their loved ones with the fence in between them. Every mile of fencing costs approximately between $7 to $19 million, depending on where it's located. There's some type of fencing that has different types of infrastructure. And so when Mr. Trump talks about building a wall, we essentially already have a lot of experience with what that means. Yes.
So the people who have not been deported can hook up with the ones who have been deported and talk through the wall? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but there's always a danger. There's a danger because at any point, the Border Patrol agents can request documentations of anyone. So there's a risk that people, with our coalition work there, we have asked them to not check IDs. And so for the most part, they have been responsive to that request. When the first weekend after Trump was inaugurated is when we started seeing changes. They started asking for IDs. So there has been some changes in the type of, and how aggressive enforcement is being done by specifically the Border Patrol, because there is a lot of support from the Border Patrol Union and the ICE Union for President Trump.
How many walls are there like this where they can talk from one side to the other?
There aren't too many. I believe there's one in Calexico. It's a much smaller area. I believe there's some spaces along, I think in El Paso there's one as well. And in some places there isn't a wall, and so there's a river, right? And so, you know, the terrain dictates that type of relationship. But Friendship Park, the Border Patrol has used it as an example nationally for how they should be engaging in diplomacy with civil society, which doesn't always represent our experience. So for instance, it used to be the case that families could sit there and could trade food, and now they're extremely restrictive about what type of contact happens at that place that they call, this is my home, you're entering my home. So they treat it as if it's their territory, when in fact they took that territory from the state of California. And so our work at Friendship Park has been trying to improve accessibility to the area, specifically those who have been most impacted by the immigration policies. And then the other type of infrastructure, CBP, Customs and Border Protection, operates 10 drones. These are the same types of drones that are that have been used in the Middle East, with the exception that they're not weaponized, even though there have been discussions about that. Each drone costs approximately between $18 to $20 million. There was one a few years ago that crashed just outside of Encinitas into the ocean. And so that's a large amount of money. And the drones, in terms of how effective they are, the Government Accountability Office has done a study, and they essentially concluded that they contribute to less than 2% of Border Patrol apprehensions. And I think they cost somewhere of about $12,000 per hour to operate. Some ridiculous number. A few years ago, Border Patrol actually entered into an agreement with the company that builds them without even having the budgetary approval from Congress. So they were trying to be preemptive in a certain way to say, we have this contract now, you have to fund 24 drones for us to operate along the border. Some of the advocacy that we have done with our partners has been to try to limit the scope or the area where drones could operate. In legislation that was proposed in 2013, we were able to get Senator Feinstein to limit it to 5 miles from the border, which essentially prevented them from operating in California, because they needed a larger distance to actually turn around. Senator McCain out of Texas was unwilling to really respond to our request to also limit the range that they would be able to operate. And so with that, I also want to add that it's important to highlight that the Border Patrol has the power to operate within 100 air miles of any border. So that's why there are checkpoints. Emmett earlier commented when he's driving from San Diego to Los Angeles, he crosses through a checkpoint. That checkpoint is roughly around 45 miles or so from the border. They can operate within 100 air miles of the border itself, and so that becomes something that's quite problematic, especially when people say, well, I'm not even at the border, I live in Riverside County. In fact, according to some of the regulations, which I have here somewhere, let's see if I can find it. Under USC 1357A and 8 CFR 287.1, CBP, or Customs and Border Protection, which includes Border Patrol, asserts power to act without a warrant and can enter onto a private property. So that also gives them the power to establish checkpoints within these 100 air miles.
And so a question about the checkpoint. So what is a citizen, and for that matter a non-citizen, what are they required to produce? So let's say I'm a U.S. citizen. You may or may not know that. I mean, you could guess it, but you don't know it. So what if I say, I refuse to show you my ID? Do I have that right?
You do have the right. If you're a U.S. citizen, you do have that right.
And what do they
Because
have?
there isn't a national ID card. There's
Right.
nothing establishing that by law we have to produce a document.
So what do they do with it? What if somebody says, what if someone looks like they're a Mexican? And that person says, I'm not going to show you my ID.
Yeah. So I have had the experience where I've been stopped in downtown San Diego by
Suspect you have.
Border Patrol on bicycles. And what I did was just simply say, I'm not going to talk to you. And I turned around and walked away. And they did not do anything. However, that doesn't mean that that will be the response each time. It could be that the response could be, okay, we're going to detain you because we have articulable facts, whatever those might be, whatever criteria they're using to determine that they have those articulable facts, that they're going to suspect, that they have reasonable suspicion to believe that I don't have proper documentation. I probably won't ever know what those are.
So reasonable cause for
Right.
that test.
No, reasonable suspicion, which is a lower grade than probable cause. So for instance, if a police officer sees me digging into a car and there's, in that area there's a high crime rate of car stereos being stolen, then there's probable cause, perhaps. Or if there was someone just robbed a corner store and they're dressed as the way the perpetrator was described is the same way I'm dressed, and there's probable cause to stop me. Whereas Border Patrol does not, they have a lower grade, which is reasonable suspicion. Now, it's important also to highlight that under the Department of Justice rules, when they produce their policy or the rules about 2 years ago on against using racial profiling, it excluded the Border Patrol. So the Border Patrol can racially profile to question someone's status. So if you're crossing through that checkpoint or walking on the street and the Border Patrol stops you, you do have the right to say, I'm not going to show you anything. And if you're a U.S. citizen, you can simply say, I'm a U.S. citizen. And that needs to be enough for them to establish that they cannot continue to question you unless they have that reasonable suspicion. Now, if you don't have U.S. citizenship status, if you're an LPR, have a visa, whatever, have DACA, whatever it might be, by law you have to produce that. You have to carry that on you all the time. And so what we're informing community members now, which is different from what we were informing them several months ago, is that carry that document with you at all times. Because in the past we would say, well, if you carry a copy of it, then it might be okay. We don't know what the response will be now, especially with some of the changes in the executive orders that provide Border Patrol with much more explicit power in detaining people and possibly expeditiously removing them, because some of those regulations will be changing sometime in the near future. If you're undocumented, we tell people don't say anything. Maybe give your name, but that's it. Don't give them any information that would justify them then using that against you in an immigration hearing. And so we go into much more detail, but that's essentially the gist of the information. There are plenty of videos on YouTube of people crossing through the checkpoints and refusing to answer, and different responses from Border Patrol, from breaking the window, pulling the people out, or people essentially being allowed to go on their way, someone challenging them in Spanish, because Border Patrol are supposed to know a certain level of Spanish. And so check out those videos, very interesting, educational in terms of what suspicionless checkpoints are all about.
What level of preparedness do you try to get people to, that could, like if you're going to a check-in or something like that, you need to be prepared in case you're taken. But so you would have the same situation here along the border or wherever ICE could show up.
Mm-hmm.
So do you counsel about preparedness as far as having things in order besides carrying the papers? That's good.
Yeah. I mean, we tell people we have an emergency plan. Just as when we're kids and we're in school, and in case of a fire, you're supposed to have a plan of where to meet your family at school or at your home. We tell them, unfortunately, in our reality, in our communities, you have to have a plan in case you are detained by immigration. Who's going to pick up your children from childcare? Who's going to pick them up from school? Who will take care of paying the mortgage if you own a home, or the rent? How will things run? What if the breadwinner is detained? How are you going to pay the bills? What if you're caring for someone who's elderly who needs to take medication, or if you have a sick child? I recently gave a human rights presentation to several families who have a child who has hemophilia. You know, who's going to care for them? So those are real questions that come up, and so we do provide information or training as to how they can best prepare. For instance, if they have a letter indicating that a cousin who has documentation status can care for the children, that cousin's name should be on the emergency report that's given to your school, for instance, so that they can pick up the children at school, because they won't release them to anyone else. That type of intricate information.
So who cares for the children? You said there's a school for children of deportees.
No, that school is only, those two schools are only in Baja California after the deportation. So those children live with their parents who have been deported in Mexico. There isn't a special school like that here in the United States that I'm aware of.
So they live in Mexico?
Some of them, so those who stay might live with a relative, or they might live with the other parent. If one parent was removed, they might live with the other parent, or an older sibling. We've seen cases where older siblings who might be 20 years old, because they're adults, their younger siblings stay with them. Yeah, so it's a crisis. It's a real crisis that communities have been suffering now for many years. All right. Just
It's a pretty horrible country.
So I'd like to move on. Let's see. I'm going to touch on that. Some of the work that we do is we accompany families who have lived through a horrendous, violent situation. These are families who have had their loved ones beaten by officials, their loved ones killed by officials. One of the cases that we have followed since 2010 was a case of Anastasio Hernandez Rojas. He was a father of 5, 42 years old at the time, who had been living in the U.S. for about 26 years. He was involved in the construction business, building swimming pools throughout Centennial County with his brother and with other individuals. And so when the economic crisis occurred, obviously he didn't have a lot of work. Mother's Day came along. He made the wrong choice, went into a store, stole flowers, bouquet of flowers, and I think meat. He wanted to surprise his wife, Maria. And so he was stopped, arrested by the cops, turned over to Border Patrol, immigration. They deported him. He spent a few weeks in Mexico, visited his family, who he hadn't seen in a long time, and then with another brother who lived in Mexico, attempted to return into the U.S. He was caught. They were both caught. In the process, he was injured. He had a prior work-related injury on, I think it was his right ankle. And so they injured his ankle. There was miscommunication in his treatment where an agent told him to, he had a bottle of water. The agent told him, throw your water out. So he dipped the bottle of water into the trash can. The agent came over and smacked his hand, threw him against the wall. And so Anastasio began asking for medical attention because his foot was injured. He was kicked to spread his legs open and patted down. The supervisor, instead of providing him with medical attention, told the same agent who had kicked him and injured him to take him to what is known as the deportation area, to remove him from Mexico. And when he did that, he was handcuffed at the time. Border Patrol claims he became violent when his handcuffs were removed, and that Border Patrol tasered him once. He fell back, hit his head, and he became unconscious. When they took him to the hospital, that he was brain dead when he arrived, and that he died 3 days after when his family arrived to say goodbye. The story was actually much more complicated than that. And the reason why we knew was because there were passerbyers who were able to film some of it. And I'm going to show some of the footage that was able to be recovered at the time. So why this case became emblematic of problems associated with the Border Patrol is because it showed that the Border Patrol was willing to suppress information about what had happened. As the case continued and interviews, the depositions that were done with the Border Patrol agents, they contradicted each other about what the circumstances and how they took place. It showed obstruction of justice. We just learned recently by some of the supervising agents where they used their subpoena power to gather information, medical information about an assessor that they did not have that authority to do. It also was emblematic of the bigger picture of what was happening with unchecked power by a law enforcement agency that's the biggest law enforcement agency in the country and quite possibly in the Western Hemisphere. You have close to 21,000 Border Patrol agents. You have an additional, I think it's 40,000 or so CBP agents. These are all agents that operate, that have the authority to question people about their status. And until recently, we did not have access to their use of force policies. In fact, on the day that they released their use of force policies that they modified as a result of advocacy that we were able to do, the same day that they released their use of force policies, that morning, that afternoon in Arizona, the Border Patrol shot someone in the back, a U.S. citizen, as he was running away. So it indicates to us that although there's a lot of work that we've done to bring greater transparency to an agency that has been out of control and operates with impunity, that there's still a lot of work that we need to do. And the crisis in that law enforcement is that there's a lack of transparency, as I mentioned, there's a lack of accountability, and few oversight mechanisms that hold them accountable. One of the advocacy challenges that we have tried to do is to get CBP agents to have body-worn cameras on their uniforms. These have demonstrated with other local law enforcement agencies that they have prevented abusive practices and also protected the police officers, because then it protects them against frivolous claims of mistreatment. Unfortunately, it hasn't gone anywhere. Under President Obama, we were able to get about $5 million for pilot studies, and now we essentially are at a standstill. We don't know how that's going to move forward under this new administration.
But the money for Obama, under Obama, was for what? For cameras?
For a pilot study.
A pilot.
Yeah. And after the pilot study was done, CBP concluded that their area of operations, their climate is so diverse that they could not find a single technology that would be adaptable to all of their diverse climate. In spite of that, we know there are GoCams and all that stuff that can be used anywhere. In spite of that, this demonstrated the challenge between within the executive branch, where you have the Obama administration wanting to move forward on it, and yet you have the line officers unwilling to adapt to those changes. We did learn last year that Border Patrol training would include the idea that they would be operating with cameras in the future. But under this new administration, we don't know where that's going to go. Mm-hmm. So I know our time is coming to an end soon. So since this topic today is about what communities are doing to resist, one of the things that I did talk about is the documentation that we do, but we also do a lot of alliance and coalition work. So we work with organizations from throughout the border, throughout San Diego County, but throughout the border as well. The Friends of Friendship Park Coalition is specific to that southwesternmost area of the U.S. Mexico border that deals with access to Friendship Park. It's where we believe we can make the biggest impact about how a park that sits on the border can represent real policy, real humane policy for how law enforcement agents can interact with dignity with those people who visit the park. The San Diego Immigrant Rights Consortium is a coalition of over 40 organizations. I chaired it for about 5 years that work on immigrant rights issues and refugee issues in San Diego County. The Southern Border Communities Coalition is a border-wide coalition. We work with over 60 organizations, mainly doing advocacy, but also some documentation of abusive practices. CIPC is a statewide coalition that we're a part of. And the Human Rights Committee Network is made up of grassroots organizations in San Diego County. These are communities that help us be the eyes and ears of the community. They're the ones that do some of the documentation, that are the first contact, that allow us to have the authority to say, we know what's going on because we're in contact with our direct community members. And then the policy impact from local, state, and national policy, not only legislative advocacy, but also administrative advocacy. So this is a photo of the training center in the RGV in Texas, where we're inside the facility, and they were demonstrating to us new technology that they have for training Border Patrol agents who might be in precarious situations. So you might have someone who's coming up at them with a rock on one end, and you have someone else running on the other end. So this technology allows them to play out different scenarios. And so this is part of the work that we've done with a working group. It's a CBO, community-based organizations working group with CBP, Customs and Border Protection. At this point, that has been severed. We don't know where it's going to move forward with this new administration. And then the organizing and leadership development that we do with the community, so with the Human Rights Committee Network. And one of the ideas that we have is that we have to document our own truth. We have to tell our own stories. Otherwise, the stories will be told from a point of view that isn't reflective of our lived experience and our reality. And so this is an African saying that we have adapted into our training that essentially poses a question, I believe, in terms of with whom do you side? Are you the hunter? Are you telling the story? Or are you in a position where you don't even have an opportunity to tell your story? So it's trying to present an idea of where do we develop power? How do we develop leadership within communities that have lived a much more marginalized reality? And it's within that documentation work that we do, the belief is it's not just for the sake of documenting and showing what patterns of abuse are taking place, but more so that, as this saying says in Spanish, says, behind every abuse there's a community. The belief is that if I'm experiencing something, then maybe my neighbor might be experiencing the same thing. So if I go at it alone and try to advocate by myself, I'm not really going to make a lot of difference. So how do we collectively challenge the power structures in a way that uses our lived experience to tell that story? So going back again to the leadership development. And then finally, this is a quote that came directly out of the experience of having Border Patrol getting on the public transportation system, which I think demonstrates an assertion of power where that power might not have been there prior to that. So essentially it says, immigration didn't leave on their own, the people kicked them out. And it became a popular chant, and that again demonstrates that reversal of power, of actualized power, to say we as people have the power to dictate how we can live with respect and dignity. And we were able to kick out immigration from the trolley and from the public transportation system, and it wasn't simply that they chose to be on their own. So I want to then see if we have any, we have about 12 minutes, so maybe what I can do is try to see if we can correct some of these, and at the same time if there are any questions. So I'll start here. The CBP budget for 2016 was in fact $13.56 billion. Yes, that's correct. Let's see. Number of jobs that depend on trade with Mexico, or 1/24th, is actually, it's not less than 2%, it's actually 5 million. So that 5 million might be somewhere, or might still be back there. This one, which is
over on the drone.
Let's see. Oh, okay. Each drone cost is, yeah, this is 5 million jobs, that depend on the trade with Mexico. The drone, as we said earlier, was between $18 to $15 million. That might be somewhere, or might still be
15. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, let's see. I think I have a 20 million for that one, though.
Photocopy these so you don't have to write them out each time.
What's that?
There's a 20 million.
Photocopy these.
No, there was a really great suggestion from the prior group. So this is something I just developed precisely for this workshops. But it is something that we're going to be looking at developing something much more formal that will be sourced. So it's not just me, out of all this stuff that I have in my head, but it's actually sourced information. The year that Operation Gatekeeper, we knew that, 1994. Number of deportations by ICE, it's not 10,000. In 2016, it was closer to over 200,000 deportations. The 10,000 figure is the number of ICE agents that are being proposed, the number of new ICE agents that are being proposed in the executive order. So that's somewhere in there. What else do we have? Yeah, the 10,000? Yeah, the 10,000 are the number of ICE agents that are being proposed in the new executive order on interior enforcement. Okay, and then number of people who have died attempting to enter the U.S. Mexico border, close. It's more like 7,500. And that number is cross-referenced with the Border Patrol, as well as human rights organizations that are charged with doing that job. This 5,500 number is the number of Border Patrol agents that are being proposed increase under the new executive order for border enforcement.
So the 7,500 deaths over what period?
From 1994 to the present. Yeah, and that occurred as a result of pushing the migration flow away from the urban centers and into the rural areas, where it was projected that the natural inhospitable terrain would be a natural deterrent, when in fact it wasn't. So, people who were accustomed to a much more lush jungle environment from southern Mexico had never seen or experienced a desert before. So when they were told, with 2 gallons you can cross the desert, 2 gallons was maybe enough for a couple of hours, and that's it, especially 120-degree heat.
Right.
And the deaths are horrendous. I mean, they are horrendous deaths that people experience. And I've had the unfortunate experience of working with families that are looking for their loved ones. We do support at least 2 organizations that do migrant rescue and recovery. We provide a satellite phone for one of them. The other, we provide opportunities for them to have speaking engagement so that they could fundraise for the work that they do. Let's see what else we have here. Total number of miles that make up the length of the U.S. Mexico border. Not quite 15 million. It's actually much less. Much less.
You're the one that didn't find a home.
240, 255. This was actually the number of deportations in 2016.
So why are there 2 numbers?
One was in 2012, which was the higher level of deportation. It was sort of the height of the deportations under the Obama administration. And then 2016, it was closer to 240 deportations. 240,000 deportations.
Yeah, that's frustrating.
Okay, any questions that you might have? Oh, one thing that I did want to, someone got this one right, total number of CBP drone arrests was less than 2%. This one, 0, is the number of Border Patrol agents that have been prosecuted for having killed someone.
Yeah, okay.
So we're talking about an over 90-year history of the Border Patrol. 93, so something like that. Okay. Any questions, any thoughts you might have in our final minutes? I think we have maybe about 8 minutes or something.
Yeah, I did have one. Let's see. So the AFSC program there in San Diego County, does that encompass how much of California's border does that with Mexico? Is that the whole thing, or is that part of it?
It's primarily only San Diego County, even though there are times when we will go to Imperial County, but it's just beyond our reach. There are 3 of us that are full time, and then we have 1 part-time person, and it's just beyond our capacity. Just to give an example, last year in 2016 we did 6 Know Your Rights trainings during the entire year as part of our outreach to the community. This year, just from January to March, end of March, we did 32. So the amount of work that has increased has been tremendous because of such an increase in fear that people have. And so we have been doing, not only going out and checking and verifying whether an immigration raid is taking place, but doing these community trainings. We are also doing we do media trainings to the community groups that organize events so that they are speaking on their own behalf to the media. We do train the trainers so that people can conduct their own Know Your Rights trainings and lessen the burden on us in some ways, but that they are then empowered with that information. We also do a lot of advocacy. So we have been doing advocacy at the state level. Right now, SB 54 is being called the sanctuary law that's being considered in the state of California. Next month, we will be attending Immigrant Day in Sacramento, which is advocating in support of certain legislation that's being considered in California. So we do a lot of work around those 4 pillars that I described, which is alliance building or coalition work, documentation of civil and human rights abuses, the policy impact, and then the organizing with community members. The much more intensive trainings that my colleague Benjamin did recently are 20-hour trainings on human rights. So he just recently did one. We'll probably do another set during the summer. And these are much more intensive because they involve coordinating with a group of people, ensuring that either on weekends or in the evenings they attend the training sessions, and at the end they graduate as human rights observers and then incorporate themselves into one of the human rights committees that operate in the community that we support as much as we're able to. Any other questions?
I have one more.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you are documenting, how do you keep from that in that one video, somebody saying, what are you documenting for? And they came after that person. Do you identify yourself, or how does that work?
We have shirts that say Human Rights Observer.
Okay.
In both English and Spanish, and so we make it a practice to carry those with us, and we have a protocol that we follow. So we tend to not go by ourselves. So and usually we want to have 2 or more cameras. The ideal team would be a team of 4, and each person would have a role. One of the team members is the only individual that should have primary contact with the authority that's there. That way it minimizes any confusion of what they might tell someone versus what they might tell somebody else.
Right.
And so someone has the tasks of writing what they see as someone else's video recording. It depends on what we're able to do at that particular moment.
And so your shirt does not identify yourself as representing the American Friends Service Committee? Or
we do have the logo of the American Friends Service Committee on our shirt. Yeah. But the bigger message for law enforcement is the human rights.
Right.
They
scares them.
If they see American Friends, they might not necessarily know what.
I know.
Yeah. Yeah. And then if we work with other organizations, for example, if there's a human rights committee that has undergone the trainings, then their logo might appear as well when we provide them with the certificates, and they develop their own logos as well, so that they are autonomous and are able then to document the work themselves. Yes.
Do you have suggestions for those of us who don't live in border communities on how to advocate and stand with these efforts? I mean, is it primarily like, urging our members of Congress to not support funding for, additional border patrol agents or those kinds of things in the budget, or do you have other thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the biggest kind of request that I would make is that people inform themselves, get as much information, as many sources as they can on the issues, and to consider that what we see through the media isn't necessarily a broad enough picture. So for instance, and I mentioned this at the last, I remember when Anderson Cooper was in the San Diego border wearing a helmet as though he was in a war zone, and he was describing it in that way. And so when you have Jeff Sessions, who was in San Diego yesterday, describing it as a war zone as well, that's not helpful to, and it's not representative of the reality of what our communities are. Our border communities in San Diego depend so much on the relationship with their counterparts in Tijuana. And I would say that's the same scenario along the entire border. And I do have an info sheet that describes 5 ways of how you can continue to be involved, one of which is signing up to one of the organizations or coalitions that we're part of, the Southern Border Communities Coalition, which is where we do a lot of our advocacy, and where there might be indications of how to advocate in favor or against a certain piece of legislation or a certain proposal, as well as following our work either through social media or I think we still have the sign up that you can send your member of Congress a message if you go to a specific link that we have on there. Yeah, and that's those 5 points would be a key way to keep in touch and also to support our message and our work. All right.
That's on your website, or where you have it?
I have it here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a nice presentation.
Okay, so if there aren't any more questions, we'll conclude here. I want to thank you for taking the time. I know it's a small group, it's late in the day.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Peter.